Okay. And if I can get it to share my screen, that would be helpful. Come on. Want to do it? Share this. Ah, there we are. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Right, okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Tony Burns. I'm one of the 3 co-directors for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. Welcome to our regular seminar series. I'm delighted that we've got Amanda Latimer from Kingston University presenting a paper to us today entitled The Dialectics of Dependency. I'll just introduce her and then explain how the session's going to go. So Amanda teaches politics and sociology, the sociology of development at the Department of Politics, at the School of Law, Social and Behavioural Sciences at Kingston University in the UK. She has a BA in anthropology from McGill University, Canada, an MA in social anthropology from York University, Canada, and she's a PhD candidate in social anthropology, also at York University, Toronto in Canada. Her doctorate examines work as opposition to the neoliberal crisis of work and free trade agreements in Brazil. Amanda is a political anthropologist whose work focuses on transnational labour and social movements against neoliberal trade and investment agreements and current debates around underdevelopment and imperialism. Her main interests are the ways in which working people, broadly defined, cut across lines of difference, nation and region to combat the race to the bottom, facing working people everywhere, albeit in very particular, historically grounded ways. Amanda has a number of publications. I've put some of them on the slide there. I'm not familiar with the first 2, but I've read the third, on the one on superexploitation in the Palgrave Encyclopedia, and I enjoyed it very much. It's excellent, so I strongly recommend that to you, as well as the other 2 publications. Amanda is also a translator. She's translated Adrian Sotelo Valencia's The Future of Work on Superexploitation, and of course, Ruy Mauro Marini's Dialectics of Dependency, and it's that work that she's going to be presumably provide the basis for her talk tonight. So the sessions goes like this. We have usually about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so for the speaker to present, and then half an hour or so for discussion, and we'll finish at 7:30. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that Amanda can. Can I ask everybody to turn off their microphones? Then that would be whilst Amanda's speaking. And at the end, of course, during the discussion, we can turn them back on again. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. Does that work? Can you see a large, handsome, mustachioed gentleman? And awesome. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides up at the same time. That's on my notes. Thank you so much for having me, Tony, and in absentia, I'm going to thank also Andreas and Oliver and just generally the center, because at least one of those publications that you flagged up got its start at a seminar that Andreas put together in 2012. And he's offered a very welcoming, warm space for this type of debate and for me to really explore these ideas in conversation with people that are working sometimes with very similar ideas, but different tools and theorists in the same space. So I really appreciate that and the space you've given me today. So I've labeled this Celebrating the Dialectics of Dependency by Ruy Mauro Marini for 2 reasons. Nope, I'll stay here. One of which is that this is, as of last year, November, the first sanctioned English translation of Marini's book. There were others that were less sanctioned. It's good that they're out there, but this is the one that was enabled by his son Felipe Marini. The other thing is that 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the book's original publication in Spanish through Ediciones Era in Mexico. So keep an eye out for things that will be happening to mark that anniversary in whatever language it's occurring in. And I do encourage people to try to tap into the commemorations and whatnot's going on in Brazil and Mexico and Chile and elsewhere this year. So as Tony mentioned, this was the two main essays that went into Marini's small book, were translated by myself, but I co-edited the book with someone else who I also want to thank before I get going, who's also not here. His name is Jaime Osorio, who is a former student and colleague of Marini. He is a professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City, but he's also the co-editor with Patricio Olave and Cristobal Reyes of the online archive of Marini's work. And Cristobal has told me that they're steadily working to increase the number of English translations of Marini's articles and books, and starting with actually his memoirs on the website. So if the ideas that you hear about today or that you've been reading and studying already are exciting to you and as exciting as they were to me when I first found him, keep an eye on the website. As a side note, I need to flog the book. So if anybody is interested in reviewing the book and doesn't yet have a hard copy, please send me your details. This is my email address here. And Menar monthly review will be happy to send you a review copy afterwards. Likewise, study groups, if there's anybody interested in doing a study group on the book, can receive copies at a 40% discount. And I need to, other than the shameless flogging, I need to also mention that the reason I'm saying this is because we were given permission to translate and publish these essays by Felipe Marini with a single message that we agreed. He wants the book to be studied and discussed and debated and not to languish on some academic library, university shelf. Although if you want to buy a copy for your library too, please let us know. That's great. But that was kind of the condition on which we were allowed to move ahead with this project. And so I really want to do that justice. We want to see him debated everywhere. Okay, so today what we're going to do, I am going to start with a pitch, which is coming from me as somebody who grew up in Canada and in a country in the imperialist North, to like-minded people in the global North as well. And then I am going to move somewhat between the different chapters of the book to provide some highlights of Marini's life, the political and theoretical context of not just the dialectics of dependency, but also the emergence of Marxist dependency theory in general. And then I will come to his thesis in the dialectics of dependency. And I need to warn people, this is a very basic introduction to his argument. And in fact, it may be a little too basic for some people in the audience, but hopefully we can get into the knots in his argument a little bit more in discussion. Throughout, I'll be interspersing some comments from my biographical chapter, but also this chapter right at the end of the volume called Notes on the Dialectics of Dependency from Jaime. And I really want to draw attention to that essay. It is something that was published in 2014 in Spanish, and then 2015 in Social Justice. And I really push to have this included in the volume. It's an excellent overview of the political and theoretical significance of the essays when they came out in the 1970s in Latin America. So I encourage everyone to take a look at it. And then, of course, we'll have discussion. I'm expecting that I'll speak for around 40 to 45 minutes. Okay, the pitch. Tony already mentioned a little bit about my doctoral research. I was very much part of the so-called anti-globalization moment of the 90s and early 2000s. And I was very much interested in looking at the structural roots of some of the things that I started to hear about when the neoliberal crisis of labor in Canada started to hit, which was, the type of things that are still around today. Kind of people complaining that Gibson guitars were now being manufactured in Mexico and instead of Pennsylvania. There were similar complaints coming from Canadian working class people and trade unions, the idea that the good jobs were going somewhere else. And at the same time, I feel, I was at university and I was told that dependency theory, for example, was dead, that it had been rebutted and argued to the point that it was no longer relevant. In the very moment, I felt that the latest round of globalization and dependency were actually intensifying. On the left, I felt like we, particularly ironically or not, in the countries with the most outward going capital, in other words, the countries with the most dynamic capitals able to take advantage of the neoliberal phase, in other words, the imperialist countries. The analysis on the left of the attack that was facing working class people was very much nationalistic. It was inward looking. It was kind of a duck and cover moment. And it's only gotten worse, I would say. This is obviously my opinion. When I got to Brazil, I very much felt like I had no conceptual tools to cope with what Marini eventually argues is the general law of accumulation unfolding across national lines. In other words, what I would argue is Marx's explanation for the race to the bottom. In other words, a structural outcome for working people of capitalist accumulation in its imperialist phase. Now, I'm also going to argue that Marxist dependency from Marini's generation, not just Marini, but his colleagues from throughout the Americas, Latin America. I'm not saying they have all the answers or that they were infallible, but it is a strong contribution towards having often difficult conversations which are in the interests of all workers. And that's my argument. So this is something I'll read from my own essay. Far from interpreting the realities of class struggle in Latin America alone, Marini's analytical framework brings into view the unity of the global working class. Many of his core works shed light on the ordering of workers at successive moments in the international division of labor, their organization around different organic compositions of capital, and so different forms and rates of exploitation. The implications of these elements must be denaturalized and problematized before we are capable of fighting capitalism as a world system and the race to the bottom it requires. The superexploitation that Marini identified as the foundation of dependency is now clearly present in the precarious lives of workers in the global north. As a part of a global working class, it stands to reason that we should all be part of the same conversation. Okay, so that's my pitch to you. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes putting Marini's life in its social and political context, political between movements and theory as well. He was born in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil in 1932, and he passed away much too early in 1997 from cancer. In that life, in the span of his life, his activities, his writing engages and covers some of the most intense periods of class struggle in Latin America's 20th century. From the 1964 coup in Brazil, which would send him into exile for the first time, to the democratic struggles waged by Mexican youth and workers in the late 1960s, brutally put down in 1968, to the intense class struggle that overtook Chile in the late 1960s, culminating in the rise of Allende and the Unidad Popular coalition, which in turn, as you know, was crushed in the September 11th coup d'etat, to the continent-wide rise of a new counter-revolutionary state and the maturing of the revolutionary left that opposed it, bolstered, supported by the Cuban Revolution, and finally, the struggles over the terms of the return to democracy in Brazil after 20 years of dictatorship and 20 years of exile for Marini in the shadow of the Washington Consensus. During all of this turmoil, Marini took part in revolutionary organizations throughout the continent. First, the revolutionary Marxist organization Workers' Politics, or POLOPE, in Brazil, and then the revolutionary left movement in Chile, or the MIR, which he belonged to in one way or another until his death. He transplanted his political focus and energy following every new violent thrust into exile, but moved consistently all over this period in the direction common to the generation of 1968 in the Third World specifically, which positioned its pursuit of socialism in the particular histories and social composition of their respective social formations, and by necessary extension, in the worldwide struggle against capitalism and imperialism. And here I just want to flag the work of Walter Rodney. Again, maybe counterintuitively, I find many parallels between Marini's work and Rodney's in this period. I really wanted to include these pictures because in the book they're rendered in very dull black and white, but the originals were these beautiful, vibrant colors. And I think this is kind of a corrective to the idea that Marini's work and also Marxist dependency theory, at one point in time, it was known as a Marxism in exile. But the reality is Marini didn't create Marxist dependency theory on his own, and every moment that he landed in a new country, having been pushed into exile yet again, he always landed in communities of other exiled intellectuals and militants, students he would take on, including my co-editor Jaime, who's up here in the right-hand corner, his colleague Francisco Piñera, but also these people down here, namely the three other people that were known as the polemical quartet, or the polemical trio of Marxist dependency theory, Vania Bombeja, Teotonio dos Santos over here in Newcastle colors, I don't know if that's deliberate or not, and Andre Gunder Frank, who unfortunately is not depicted. But the point is that the germs of Marxist dependency theory take root in the exchanges and investigations that take root in these relationships, whether in Brazil, in Brasilia, in exile in Chile at CESO at the University of Chile in Santiago, or for much of his life, the later part of his life, in Mexico at two different universities. I also think I have no proof, but I expect that these conversations also for the creation of the Dialectics of Dependency itself, an extended essay and postscript that began life in a 1971 seminar at CESO in the University of Chile, called Marxist Theory in Latin American Reality. And with that, I will finally turn, no, one more thing before I get to that. Excuse me. Okay, so I do need to mention before I get to Dialectica, the project of Marxist dependency theory, where it came, why it came about, when it did. Essentially, Marxist dependency theory comes out of a backlash to both the Main Street development theories, namely their failure of theories largely imported from the United States, but also Britain. So we're talking modernization theory, monetarism, and from Britain, Keynesianism. Also, the destruction of structuralism in the mid-60s with the coup d'etat in Brazil in 1964 and then 1968, coming out particularly of the UN Office on Latin America and later the Caribbean called CEPAL. But also in backlash to the centering of class alliances between workers, peasants, and the national bourgeoisie by the traditional communist parties of the region. And so this is a point of contrast with criticisms of dependency theory that tend to reduce it as something like just simply imperialist domination of countries in the global South. With Marxist dependency theory, they are specifically doing battle with the idea that the national bourgeoisie will be capable of leading a bourgeois revolution along the lines of Russia or the classical industrial revolutions. So the task for these writers, including Marini, was to come up with a response to the issue of why, after in Brazil, 30 years of industrial development by the 1960s, there had been no industrial takeoff. Marini begins to look for the answer to this issue in the very formation of Latin American economies. But for Marxist dependency theorists in general, and this is an idea that comes from Jaime Osorio, the task was to come up with a theory of Latin American capitalist development as such in order to be able to discern what kind of revolution was required in the region. So I'll just read a section. This comes from Jaime's last chapter in the volume. In this context, it was necessary to recreate Marxism, but not to repeat Marx, because the unprecedented problem was to substantiate the existence of a new modality of capitalism and to define its developmental trends within the framework of this relationship with the world capitalist world system. That is what Marini's book, Dialectica de la Dependencia, offers to theory and Marxism, no more and no less. Okay, so finally I'm going to turn to Marini's essays, and I will slow down a little bit here. Okay, with this project in mind, this task in mind, Marini starts his essay with a methodological statement that actually uses Marx to take aim at the way orthodox Marxists had studied Latin American backwardness, so-called, to date. He takes issue with the reduction of Latin American social formations to the abstraction of pre-capitalism by noting, as Marx himself does, but certainly not from the vantage point of the Americas, that the Latin American economy emerged in tight consonance with European capitalism and with the very beginnings of the world system. In this sense, in this context, it makes no sense to argue that something that was coeval or that unfolded at the same time as European capitalism is a historical throwback. Rather, Marini argues that the task is to understand the peculiar character that Latin American capitalist development has taken since its inception, or what he calls sui generis capitalism, and after the independence of the region from colonialism, dependency, essentially, dependent development. This is one of the quotes he has from volume 3 of Capital, which I really love. He says, in theory, we assume that the laws of the capitalist mode of production develop in their pure forms. In reality, this is only an approximation, but the approximation is all the more exact the more the capitalist mode of production is developed, and the less it is adulterated by survivals of earlier economic conditions with which it is amalgamated. I'm wondering if Marx had actually read Marini's work a century later, how this quote might have been adjusted towards the end here, if we ever get closer to the abstraction. Okay. All right, so Marini gives a very general definition of dependency quite early in the essay as a relation of subordination between formally independent nations in which the formation of which, in the framework of which, the relations of production of the subordinate nations are modified or recreated to ensure the expanded reproduction of dependency. So here, again, and I touched on this a minute ago, dependency is not a matter of imperialist capitals landing on and overdetermining the productive relations of dependent economies to extract profits. Rather, the position of the region in the world system, the way it functions in the world system at any given moment, informs class relations and the productive system in the latter at different moments in the international division of labor. So Marini actually itemizes several moments that saw a transfer of value from dependent economies to the metropole or imperialist countries under both formal empire, but also in the period of dependency or possibly informal empire that follows. The relation that matters for us here is the exchange of goods that the two regions come to specialize in from the 17th century onwards. In other words, the exchange of manufactured or finished goods from Europe, and in his discussion, he is speaking very deliberately about England, and in the dependent economies, unfinished primary goods. In other words, raw materials, minerals, foodstuffs, and so on from Latin America. But again, in his discussion, he's focusing on Brazil and Chile. Marini argues that such specialization, in other words, the mere fact that some produce goods that the rest do not, or that they cannot produce as easily, allows the former to evade the law of value, that is, to sell their products at prices higher than their value, thus giving rise to an unequal exchange. He continues, we've seen that the problem that unequal exchange poses for Latin America is not precisely that of counteracting the transfer of value it implies, but rather that of compensating for a loss of surplus value, and that unable to prevent this loss at the level of the normal functioning of the market, the dependent economy reacts by compensating for it at the level of domestic production. In other words, he's drawing a line between this relation of these exchange relations and labor superexploitation, but more precisely, working class, the formation of the working class, both in England at a particular moment and in Latin America. Now, before we get to superexploitation itself, Marini charts the highly divergent effects of this exchange. And remember, this is the period, the celebrated period of free trade among so-called sovereign nations. The effects of this exchange on the relations of production within both England and Brazil and Chile. And his argument is two-sided here. The first point is this, that by the 19th century, Marini argues that the acquisition of primary goods from Latin America feeds into the shift from the production of absolute surplus value to that of relative surplus value in England, beginning in the 1840s. That cheap raw materials feed the technical transformation of the labor process, leading to or helping to produce greater labor productivity, and that cheap foodstuffs likewise lower the cost of the social reproduction of the English worker. However, something else happens in Latin America itself. Same drivers, different effects. Specifically, instead of likewise investing in the advancements, technical advancements in the means of production in order to boost labor productivity, local capitalists and oligarchs resort to labor superexploitation. Now, there is a caveat coming. I just want to flag that. But in general, this is where he is in the argument. For Marini, labor superexploitation occurs through a combination of a variety of techniques for extracting surplus value. He notes the first is to increasing the intensity of labor through greater rates of exploitation in lieu of developing workers' productive capacity. Secondly, the prolongation of the working day and specifically of surplus labor time. And thirdly, and by definition, reducing the necessary consumption fund of the worker below its normal level so that part of that fund becomes a fund of accumulation. So the result in practical terms is the premature and physical exhaustion of the worker while they should still be part of the economically active population, and the exhaustion of their labor power prematurely. And here he points to the experiences in plantations and mines of the region. Okay, the second factor stems from that final point. Whereas in England, despite the undisputed hardship of life for workers in Victorian England, the conditions arise where workers are able to often buy the very use values they produce. Capital reproduction reinforces the formation of a national economy in this way, despite the transnational existence of Britain as an imperialist country in this very same period. However, by way of contrast, in the export economies of Latin America in the same period, these two sides of the worker as a producer and consumer of use values is pulled apart. In other words, working class consumption is not required for the realization of capital investment, which relies instead on the external markets of the metropole. And I'm reminded of the shift in China after the 2010 crash to deliberately fostering their domestic market. Not saying that they're an underdeveloped country in a simple sense, but that's an example of what he's talking about here. So, in other words, in a world system composed of productive forces that vary significantly in terms of the respective organic compositions of capital, which point to different forms and degrees of labor exploitation, the heightened demand for food and raw materials by industrialized countries, whose economies are characterized by higher organic compositions, will be met by the more extensive and intensive use of labor power in dependent ones. This causes, for Marini, the value of the commodities produced to increase, which makes surplus value and profit rise simultaneously. Now, I just want to make one additional note, which comes from the second essay in the volume from Marini himself, the postscript to Dialectics of Dependency. And this is a note that he makes in response to Fernando Enrique Cardoso. You may know that Cardoso immediately responded to Marini's essays and challenged the idea that superexploitation was inevitable in Brazil. by pointing to the production of relative surplus value taking place in the industrial factories of Brazil under the dictatorship. So for him and his later Jose Serra, and other co-authors, modernization along the lines experienced in the metropole was in fact possible, and you could, with the right incentives to national capital, to the national bourgeoisie, sidestep superexploitation. So Marini's response to Cardoso is quite extensive. It continues in 1978 in a brilliant essay that I really wish I could have included in this volume, but which is available in English. But I just want to highlight one thing that he says here, which is that it's perfectly responsible for relative surplus value to exist in countries like Brazil or Mexico or Colombia, all the while that labor superexploitation is also being reproduced. But the issue is which characteristic is more germane, more fundamental to the dependent formation. Moreover, he argues that the drive to reproduce labor superexploitation will come from the mode of production itself. And here comes this final quote from him. The productive relationship between the increase in the productive capacity of labor and the greater exploitation of the worker, which becomes severe in the dependent economy, is not exclusive to the latter, but rather is generated by the capitalist mode of production itself. And he does go on, and I really encourage you to really delve into his further works. Hopefully they will be made available at some point. I am skipping over other points that may be more interesting for some of you. And as I said, I hope that we can pick some of them up in discussion. But I do want to note that Marini's work on dependency and specifically on labor superexploitation continue in later works right until he passed away in 1996. These works continue to unfold in response to critics like Cardoso, but also in his attempts to make sense of the new conjuncture beginning in the 1980s. And I specifically want to highlight articles in 1978, 1979, and a very brilliant one that was published posthumously in 1997. His line of analysis continues in the work of his students, including Adrian Sotelo, who I don't have here, but certainly Jaime Osorio and his students in turn. And I just want to highlight a book that they have coming out in English from Ibidem Press called Labor Superexploitation, Unequal Exchange and Capital Reproduction. It's also continued in other people's works in the global north, and I want to highlight a few. Andy Higginbottom's work, just to highlight a couple of articles that speak directly to labor superexploitation. His work in 2012 and 2017, which start to tease out the connection between Marini and the 3 volumes of Capital. This includes an exploration of labor superexploitation as a category that actually goes beyond absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, and so prompts a wider reconsideration of surplus value. And of course, I also have to mention the work of John Smith. I've only got his book here, but he's continued to develop this, and Zach Cope, likewise, on the fact that we are absolutely, that superexploitation is a global phenomenon now. Politically, the upshot of the dialectics of dependency and the Marxist dependency framework are very simple. That the only way to end dependency is through the end of the world system that creates it, of the capitalist mode of production, in other words, revolution. Just to circle back to where I started from with my pitch, we are witnessing, without a doubt, greater incidents of super exploitation. I want to highlight that in Brazil, at a moment when You know, outfits like The Economist were celebrating the new Brazilian miracle at the height of the commodity super cycle from 2002 to about 2014 in the most integrated sectors, the most dynamic, profitable sectors that were integrated with global capital. In other words, the most modern. You had heightened rates of, we saw super exploitation. I'm thinking here of the ethanol sector that was tied into steel production, the search for the markets for alternatives to fossil fuels in the United States and Europe. Also, the steel production in Brazil. You also see the upshot of this framework in the defeats and the violence that have come at the end of the latest attempts to bring about a social democratic solution in Latin America. And I'm thinking again of Brazil, the pink tide governments and in general and their crisis. I'm thinking about the removal, the very violent removal of Aristide from Haiti and so on. And of course, we're seeing super exploitation in the working lives of many people in the global north, including in England. So all of this to say we should revisit both these works, I think, and the political message that they're driving towards as well. Thank you for listening.
That's great. Thank you very much. Right, I'll stop recording. I think that's the practice, so we'll do that.